great privilege and a pleasure to welcome Dr. Alison Armstrong here to give an SLRG seminar. I don't really know quite how to introduce Alison. When she first came to CES, she was a very, very solid, excellent engineer. And as some of you know, one of the things that we do to engineers when they come to CES is to turn them into something else. And what we turned Alison into was a very, very excellent psychologist with a little bit of sociology thrown in, and perhaps more interestingly, a mindfulness guru. A mindfulness guru to the NHS, to the Stars, to Guardian Sustainable Business blog, and a number of other places as well. To be honest, we didn't turn her into that at all. Alison always came to see us with a very, very clear vision of what she wanted to do, what she wanted to research, where she wanted to go, and she did it. And her PhD really was a joy to behold, to come out to that. And it's fantastic, I think, that Alison has on the back of that really begun already to build her own working life around the intellectual ideas that interest her, really taking ideas into the community. I'll let her tell you the story about her job interview with the NHS. But I'm really looking forward to hearing her talk about mindfulness and compulsive behaviour.
Thanks, Tim. It is a real pleasure to be back and to actually have time here without it being focused around trying to write a thesis. And it's really nice to have the chance to share with you some of the research that I've done. So I realised as I was looking at the poster on the door that I probably should have read that before I prepared the slide, because it might be slightly different to what I promised. But basically what I want to talk to you about is one of the 3 studies I did for the PhD, which was a slightly ambitious study and probably could have got me the PhD in its own right without anything else. But it's certainly been my sort of passion to set this study up and to do it. So just want to give a little bit of context as to where I came, how I got to this point of wanting to study consumption. Partly it was in my work as an engineer and realising the overconsumption that was not benefiting anybody really, above a certain point of material comfort, of course. And then increasingly through Tim and through other excellent writings, just realising that the kind of consumer patterns we have in the West are not particularly good for us as individuals, beyond a certain level of material comfort, not good for the social fabric of the country, or even the social equity issues across different countries. And of course, ecologically, every single thing that we buy and use has an ecological impact. So there's this kind of, what on earth are we doing carrying on like this? And it might seem at first glance slightly contrary to apply mindfulness to this, because it comes from Buddhism and it's encouraging a non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. Well, you could say, so what? But what research has shown and what anecdotal evidence we've got, and my own personal experience with it, is that mindfulness improves individual social and ecological well-being. So it seems to me there's an intuitive connection here. They're not 2 completely separate things. But of course an intuitive connection is maybe enough to form a research question, but it's not enough to actually, you need to do a little bit more in order to investigate that, which is what I set out to do. So just taking the consumption side to begin with, I'm looking mostly at psychologically motivated consumption. So by this, I mean consumption that is driven by affective needs, so the emotional needs, feelings. And this in modern society would be called retail therapy. And it's a very flippant term, and we quite often hear people say, you know, oh, I'm not feeling great, I'll go for a bit of retail therapy. So that's what I'm talking about. It makes us feel good, so there's a feeling aspect to it. But I'm also talking about symbolic purchasing. And this is I've just put up two theories here. Basically, it's the symbolic role that material goods can play for us. So symbolic self-completion theory, for example, would say you maybe take on an identity and you want to become seen as someone who's a runner. And so you go out and you buy the training shoes and you buy the equipment. And these are the symbols of being a runner. These are the symbols that will help you to be defined by others in that capacity. And self-discrepancy theory, which I'm going to talk about later, is basically a similar sort of idea of saying, this is how I feel I am, this is who I feel I am, but this is actually who I'd like to be. And so we use those material goods in order to bridge that gap. And I'll talk about that more in relationship to the data that I've got. Now, of course, there are other types of consumption, and I've put it in brackets, functional consumption, because obviously we have to buy things just to be able to get on in life and to be able to travel and be able to stay warm, and there's functional things we have to buy. And of course these things aren't totally separate. We say, okay, I need a new handbag, and that's a functional thing we need, but of course there will be symbolic and affective elements to that. So these aren't completely separate, but what I'm talking about mainly is the affective and the symbolic side, which for most people is fine. It's part of how we live our lives. But for some people, this can get out of control. And the compulsive buyer is what I decided to focus on, because it's really interesting to look, well, I felt it was interesting to look at the extreme end of buying behaviour. Because not only can it tell you quite a lot about them, but it actually, if you think of them being on a continuum with everybody else, it can tell you quite a lot about everybody else as well. So the compulsive buyer basically experiences spontaneous urges to buy, and experience them as intense and as urgent. There's that need to have to buy things. It's usually related to the act of buying itself rather than the good, although the type of goods that people are attracted to will be of a certain type. There's a definite lack of control, and it's related to extreme positive feelings, excitement, stimulation, feeling good. And the behaviour will continue despite the negative consequences that result, things like huge amounts of debt, relationships that break down, health that can suffer. And it's because of that it's often classed as a type of addiction. It's confusing in the literature. It's usually termed compulsive buying, but yet everybody takes it as an addiction. So the two, I'm going to use compulsive buying, but it is an addiction. And the way that I think of addiction is as a biopsychosocial model. So I'm not saying it's a personality type. I'm not saying that it's a disease. I'm saying that it's got biological or genetic elements to it that may contribute to people's susceptibility to becoming a compulsive buyer. But it also has psychological elements, and it also has social and cultural elements. So you don't get compulsive buyers really in the developing world, other than in the wealthy elite section of the developing world. So the social and cultural sort of setting is also quite fundamental to whether compulsive buying actually exists. I'm not going to say too much about how compulsive buying develops, but I do want to just talk briefly about the gender issue, because this always comes up. Everyone just assumes it's women more than men. And what I would say is that it probably is women more than men. It's very hard to say, actually, because if you look at the research and the way that people recruit their participants, the recruitment itself is often aimed more at women. So of course you're then going to make the assumption that it's women more than men. But in actual fact, the labelling is quite important. So if we call it shopping addiction, you're going to get women who are going to respond. If you call it collecting, you're more likely to get men. So kind of what you call it is also quite important. But yet, nonetheless, even taking into all those factors into account, it is women more than men who seem to be affected by this. It's about 5.5% to 16% of the population. So the lower end of that spectrum would be across the entire adult population. So that's actually still quite a lot of people affected. The higher estimate tends to be if you are looking at young adults. So if people take a sample in their research of university students, then you're going to get more up towards the 12 to 16, because there is this peak of occurrence between the ages of about 18 and 25. And it quite often occurs alongside other psychological factors like depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, and other compulsive behaviours. And some people have said to me, well, I think I could probably be an alcoholic, but I've chosen to be a compulsive shopper. Yeah. So there's this certain amount of, actually it's got, if people are going to have this kind of addiction or an addiction, then you know, people actually have said that it was more acceptable to be a shopping addict than to be an alcoholic. But it can occur alongside other behaviours. I'm quite happy to take questions as we go along, by the way, but maybe just questions if there's something that you're not understanding, and then I'll take the sort of other questions.
Can I ask you, Alison, peak occurrence as young adults, 18 to 25.
Yeah.
Is it an age group, or is it that group of people? You know, in 5 years' time, will it be 23 to 30-year-olds?
No, I think it's because you'll see with some of the data that I've got later on, there's a lot wrapped up in this around identity, and about if people don't have a clear sense of who they are, then they use material goods to try and define who they are. And at that age group, you're quite vulnerable to not knowing that.
Okay, so it's not that particular age group
No.
haven't experienced such?
No.
No, thanks.
Okay. So I'm just going to now do a little bit of introduction about mindfulness itself, and then get into the nitty-gritty of the data. So a common definition of mindfulness is the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of experience moment by moment. So even within that definition, you can see different facets kind of emerging. So you've got awareness, and you've got paying attention, you've got being non-judgmental. So it's very hard actually to say that what mindfulness is in one easy sentence, because it's made up of different aspects, and some of the scales that are used in order to measure mindfulness reflect that. They have different facets within the scales. So mindfulness is developed mainly through meditation. If you measure a typical population, then you'll find that people will naturally have different levels of mindfulness, but you can also increase that, and that's quite often done through meditation, which is done through courses. The mindfulness-based stress reduction and the cognitive therapy courses are both widely available, and they're generally run over 8 weeks. And they involve both formal and informal practice. So formal meditation of maybe half an hour a day, and informal practices of gradually encouraging this present moment awareness to be infiltrated throughout life, not just when we set aside that formal time. And I'm not going to say much about the effectiveness, but basically mindfulness has been shown, there's a huge amount of research on mindfulness now, and it has been shown to be effective for mood disorders, for low self-esteem, good for self-regulation, and so on. So basically, you've got these 3 areas: psychological, as in sense of self-identity and so on. You've got emotions and mood and behavioural issues, and there's these links between both the overconsumption and compulsive buying side and the mindfulness side. And so this is what I basically formulated my research about. So the research questions for this one study that I came up with, basically I wanted to see what would happen if compulsive buyers learn mindfulness, and what could that tell us more broadly about consumer behaviour and about mindfulness itself. So I wanted to know, what is it like, first of all, to be a compulsive buyer, and then what's it like when compulsive buyers learn mindfulness. And I was particularly interested in around this sort of the psychological process of change, and how can we expand that? What are the implications of that for mindfulness being applied to consumer issues more broadly and sustainability? So my study design was basically, so I had 3 groups which are listed down the left-hand side. I had compulsive buyers who were going to learn mindfulness. I had compulsive buyers who did not learn mindfulness, and I had so-called normal buyers, as in they had no tendency towards compulsive buying, and they learn mindfulness alongside the compulsive buyers. And the mindfulness intervention lasts for 8 weeks, and it's basically 2 hours a week of learning these formal and informal practices. So I collected data before the intervention started, I collected it halfway through, and I collected it immediately after the intervention had finished, and then again right at about 3 months later, just to see what would happen. And depending on the group, depended on what I collected. So I only interviewed the compulsive buyers who learn mindfulness, and I interviewed them on all 3 different occasions. But other than that, I collected questionnaire data. So I asked them, for example, to fill out a scale that would measure their levels of depression and that sort of thing. And I also videotaped each of the mindfulness sessions, the 2-hour sessions, just so that I had a sense of what had happened during that time. So the participants themselves, of my 6 compulsive buyers, these are the ones who you're going to hear most about for the rest of this talk. 6 of them started, only 5 of them completed. Of the original 6, 5 were female and 1 was male. And the male was early 20s, which is actually quite common. If you're going to get a man who's a shopping addict, he's probably going to be a young professional, and which he was. The others, the women, were in an age range of between 21 and 59, so quite a big age gap there. And they were recruited mostly because I got some publicity through the local paper, and people then contacted me as a result of that.
Alison, sorry, if you don't mind me interrupting again.
That's fine.
Were these self-diagnosed?
They had to be.
Okay.
So the interesting thing is I will have got people who not only recognise they have a problem, but are also at the point where they're motivated to do something about it.
Yes, thanks.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so although I'm not going to draw too much on this, and you won't be able to read this, I want to give you a sense of this was the range of measures that I put into my questionnaire that the 3 groups filled out. So mindfulness, tendency to be a compulsive buyer, impulse buying, obsessive compulsiveness more generally, depression, anxiety, etc. I just put this up to kind of illustrate that I collected a huge amount of data from these people, and I'm just going to draw on a couple of these scales to give you an idea of what I got. So basically, most of the rest of the talk is looking at the data itself, mostly the interview data that I got. So before they had the mindfulness intervention, my questions were to them, what's it like for you to be a shopping addict? And the results kind of fell into 3 categories. It fell into the emotional role of buying, the symbolic role of buying, and then the aspects to do with having an addiction itself. So the emotional role of buying, so this is where it's going to get quite wordy, because it's very hard to present qualitative data without it getting wordy. So Fran says, things I find particularly hard are decisions to do with my children, because I feel whatever I'm doing or decide will affect them. And if I'm faced with 2 decisions, I'll analyse, I'll look at both sides, because each one could have a knock-on effect, and then I'll take that beyond to if I go down that route and that knock-on effect. So you can see this cycle that she's in. She's got depression issues, she's got a lot of anxiety issues, because if you've got anxiety, you're tending to go into the future to try and predict what's going to happen, and a lot of worry around that, and a lot of responsibility. And she has a big intolerance to this kind of level of uncertainty around being a parent. And so you can begin to see, she says, I get caught up in the whole world of shopping, which takes me away from worrying about perhaps things I don't want to, because I'm worrying about the shopping, should I take it back? So you can see she's still worrying, but she's actually transferred her worry onto something that feels more manageable, so that she can let go of the worry to do with her children. So other ways that people were buying in order to feel better. So Katie says, I just had massive panic attacks all the time, and so I think I was trying to make myself feel better, and actually have control over something else. So ironically, having an addiction means you're out of control, but what they were doing was trying to gain control over the rest of their life, feeling out of control. And that's when the shopping started to get quite bad. To go and do something and make yourself feel a little better, a little bit brighter. And then Katie also talked about, she did a lot of clothes shopping from eBay, and she talked about when things would arrive in the post. It's kind of like getting a present, because you're kind of opening it up, they're kind of wrapped up. So it's this giving oneself a present almost. And then she would say, when she then put on the things that were new, she'd say, when I go out of the house or whatever, wearing something new, I feel like I don't feel as normal as I do every other day. So to her, obviously, this feeling of normality was not something she had a great deal of tolerance for. And so she used this idea of having new things in order to overcome that. She used the word shinier. I feel shinier when I leave the house. So they were very much acting out this kind of modern idea of retail therapy. But it wasn't quite as simple as that, because these vicious cycles, as I called them, became established. So June says, I'm aware of depression being there, and that I mean the anxiety, and of course it gets worse because the last year or two I've realised what an enormous debt I've mounted up, and the anxiety's so great now, I'm like treading on eggshells. So the irony is that she's shopped so much that she's now got this debt, which she's anxious about, and she's so anxious she goes shopping. So these cycles become established. And in a similar way, she said, I think it's the guilt, the awful shame. Why have you done this? If I had an illness like a cancer or something, you would say to a friend, but this is an illness in a way that you can tell nobody. It's like I'm in some dreaded disease. So here it was, the vicious cycle was around loneliness. She was lonely, so she went shopping, and then because she'd overshopped and felt this shame, she couldn't tell anyone, which exacerbated her feelings of loneliness. So you can see how these things get established and then how difficult it is to break them. So the second of the major themes that I had here was the symbolic reasons for buying. And here June says, but you sort of want to live this double life, I mean, I look at my wardrobe and I think there's loads of clothes that I hardly ever wear that were bought on the basis that I'm a different woman. It's like leading a double life. There's this woman who goes shopping all the time, who's buying things to be a woman, some other woman, and then there's me that doesn't really know who I am anymore, don't know what I've done it for. So there's this real sense of being so lost. She doesn't have any idea who she is, and the clothes help her at that moment of buying to think, oh, I am that person, but then she doesn't actually wear them. And it was at this point, I think, in this interview, I just wanted to give her a hug. You just feel so sad that someone's in that. I mean, she was 59 years old, approaching retirement, and in this situation of not knowing who she was. So there was also, for some of the others, this idea of the self-discrepancy that I mentioned earlier. So Maggie says, I've recently put on a hell of a lot of weight, which I absolutely hate. I hope I can lose this weight, which might be a natural desire, but yet at the same time, the way that they use the clothes in order to try and bridge that gap, because they believe the clothes will make them look slimmer. And June, again, I've even bought clothes that don't really fit me. I bought them for Minuet, which is for petite women, because maybe I wanted to be petite. So again, it's using the symbolism of the clothes in order to try and be somebody that they're not. And Fran was very interesting. I preserved this front, I'm always the mum at the school that's baked all these cakes, I wouldn't miss a thing like that. So here she actually uses the way she dresses and her vast array of kitchen equipment in order to bridge that gap between her actually feeling quite inadequate as a mother and actually feeling like, if I do all these things, then I'll feel like I am a good mother. A couple more on this. Ethan says, I suppose the branding, the label and the advertisement creates a sense of quality, creates a sense of excitement. You buy a product that's just had an amazing ad campaign, and because everyone's seen it, it's like you're then part of that campaign. So here he's using the symbolism associated with an advert and using that to enhance his own qualities. And this was an amazing, quite a lot of people spoke about the symbolism of bags, shopping bags. You come out and by the time you get home, you've got like 5 different bags. You know, you're kind of walking along and you think, yeah, people can see I've been shopping and I feel like I've had a good day here, especially with the nice bags that are sort of with the string and everything, not the plastic ones. And that makes me feel like you've done something worthwhile. So can you see, first of all, the social element? What these people rely on is that other people see them with either the clothes that were in the ad campaign or the bags. But just how sad it is that someone's got to the stage of needing shopping bags in order to give them a sense of worth. So there was also the addiction element, which I won't spend too much time on, but basically it was these sorts of conversations people had with themselves in order to justify their current purchasing. So Maggie said, oh, I think just this once sort of thing, I'll just do it now and then I'll wear these and then that'll be good and I'll get rid of some of the others that I've got that I don't want anymore, and then these will last me for a few years, but it doesn't work like that. So there's these internal conversations going on all the time to help them to justify the buying, but obviously realizing it doesn't actually work. And Fran says, if I buy something that I think looks nice in one colour, then I've got to get it in all the other colours because I think, oh yeah, that does make me look okay, I'd better get more of those. I get carried away and almost to the point where I'm so hyped up in a shop that I'm not really sure of what I'm doing. So you can see this incredible disconnect between their sense of themselves. And Fran was incredible. She lived in a very large house that basically when I went there, there was stuff basically everywhere. And as I went to leave, I was kind of leading the way to the front door, and I had forgotten the route, and I went to open the door, and she, oh no, don't open that door, you know, because basically if I'd opened it, this mountain of bags stacked behind it would have come falling down, because she had stuff everywhere, and it was quite extraordinary. So there was also the post-purchase regret. So Katie says, and then you get home and you look at your bags. These bags that were a moment ago her symbol of her sense of worth. And then she gets home and then she says, fuck it, I can't afford this. I've done it yet again. So there's that sense. And what Katie did was very interesting. She immediately took the tags off clothes because she couldn't tolerate that, oh, I ought to take it back. Oh, but I really love it. That conversation, she was so intolerant of that, she immediately took the tags off because then she could avoid that. And like I was just saying with Fran, the stuff that she had everywhere and the impact, the wider impact that had on the family, on her husband and on the children. And you know, she says the children don't like it because she can't get into those rooms. It's quite extraordinary. And June spoke about her son saying to her, oh, why can't we go to the supermarket? And they can't go because she spent all the money on clothes. So it has this huge impact on the rest of the family. Any questions so far? Okay. So after the intervention, so they then spent 8 weeks basically coming 2 hours a week here to the university to learn these mindfulness techniques where they were taught meditation. They had to practice every day doing meditation. After week 6, they did an all-day silent day of practice, which when you're a shopping addict, spending a day in silence at the beginning would have been completely impossible for them. But after 6 weeks of these techniques, that's what they did. And this is basically then the data that I collected from after they'd done the mindfulness. So this was the interview immediately after, the interview that was 3 months later, and also the data that I collected from the videotapes while the course was going on. So I'm not going to do much on the quantitative measures, but basically the solid black line is my group of compulsive buyers who learn mindfulness. So the first data point is before they learn mindfulness, and then immediately afterwards, and then 3 months later. And the top graph is the measure of mindfulness itself. So you can see mindfulness has increased and then it's stabilized. And this bottom one is their tendency to be a compulsive buyer, which you can see has dramatically reduced and then has stabilized. So although I can't do major stats on this data because I've only got 5 people who completed, nevertheless it does show that there has been some change for this particular group. So the data from after the intervention didn't fall neatly into symbolic, affective and addictive elements. It was much more complex than that. So the first thing that they seemed to require was actually a basic understanding of what mindfulness was. And June puts it quite nicely. It's more to do with awareness. It's not about relaxing so much. It's more about your awareness, heightening your awareness. So she got it. She understood. And Fran, well, they all understood this element of being curious about experience rather than having to avoid experience. And that filtered into their everyday lives. It didn't actually stay just within the mindfulness, the formal time. So Fran says, always on the first day back I want to wear new clothes, and I didn't this time. So this was her first day back to work after a holiday. I made myself, I thought, no, why do I need to wear new clothes? Wear something I've worn before and see what happens. See what happens is curiosity about what, if they start doing things differently. That was all right, and I think, yeah, it's just doing it differently. So you can start to see already there's been a change. If they didn't require something new for that particular occasion, you've already reduced the amount of stuff they're buying. Now, most of the data from after the intervention fell into this broad category that I've called choice over thoughts and feelings, but it's primarily to do with different aspects to do with self-regulation, which obviously if you're trying to change someone who's an addict, then trying to help them to be more able to self-regulate is quite important. So I'm going to go through each of these. So I'm going to start with a sub-theme that I called, so that's how I think and feel. So this is about them starting to have an awareness of themselves. Fran said, I think I realised I'm not very kind to myself. In fact, I think I beat myself up a lot of all of the time. So there's this sense of actually starting to realise how her relationship with herself is actually going to impact on other things in her life. And Fran also talked about having this sudden awareness that she could get positive feelings from other areas of her life. So here she's talking about a day she had out with her children for Halloween to get pumpkins. And she said, it's not the same rush that I get with the shopping or that initial, but the overall experience gives a much nicer feeling. It's a more relaxed feeling. Whereas with the shopping, it's that initial rush, all that excitement, and then you've got all the coming down from that and all the worry and everything afterwards. This might not be the massive rush at the beginning. It's a more gentle, gradual process in that you plan it, you go off, we do it, we have fun. So the buzz was less, I suppose, but it went on for longer and lasts, and it didn't have this awful crash afterwards. So what she's doing here is she's widened where she can get positive feelings from. So she can get it from time with her children, and she can recognise the different quality of that versus when she was shopping. It wasn't all quite plain sailing, because if you ask an addict to focus on their own body sensations, which is one of the first exercises they do, it can trigger some quite strong reactions, and Maggie was one of them. It made me feel extremely panicky, and I had to sit up thinking, I've got to stop this, this is awful. Because what you have to remember is that if you've spent many years trying to avoid emotions and trying to avoid experiences, and then you start to focus in on your own body where these experiences are happening, then that can be quite overwhelming at the beginning. But she stuck with it, which was great. There was also an ability after they'd learned mindfulness to see things to do with the consumer culture. And June says, marketing messages are just so unrealistic. I do know that now. Well, I always knew it at the back of my mind, but you suppress that realistic thought because your mind's taken over on euphoria. So here she's actually was talking about advertisements and realising how unrealistic they are. So another thing that June discovered was her relationship, her emotional relationship with clothes. She says, I mean, it's funny with clothes. I've got things in my wardrobe that I can remember I wore that when I was very upset, and it's got emotional attachments. I thought to myself, well, you know, they'll say, you know, a skirt I wore on holiday and had an argument with my husband while I was wearing it. That's nothing to do with the skirt. I didn't see that at all before. You know, this is why we're always looking for something new that hasn't got the attachment. So there's that need to buy things that are emotionally clean because of that intolerance to negative emotion that they have. And she sort of was beginning to see through that, and therefore she could begin to wear that skirt again because she could see through the emotional attachment that she had attributed to it. They then went through a process of starting to consciously see things differently. So part of what the mindfulness teacher did with them was to help them to use metaphor in order to describe emotional experience. Because again, if you're an addict, you'll find it quite often difficult to describe what your emotions actually are because you're so out of touch with them. And so she used a lot of metaphor in order to help with that process. So the teacher had said to her, see your emotions like the sea, and sometimes the sea's rough and sometimes it's not. And she said, the teacher said, you have to just accept that's how it is. And I think, well, I'm going to be choppy at this time. And I found just by doing that, things would appear on the turbulent sea. That's how it is. So I do try to do that. When I get times that are difficult, I do try and do that. And I think, well, this is how it is. I just have to accept that it's choppy and I can't necessarily do anything about it. So then I said, and do you find that you're able to accept? And she said, I can. It very much depends on how I'm feeling. So you can see that they're starting to actually be able to see their experiences differently. And acceptance is a huge part of mindfulness. And if I could change one thing about the definitions of mindfulness, it would be to include acceptance more strongly in there. And this process of it's called in psychology speak, it's called reappraisal, where basically you look at a situation that is usually quite emotionally difficult and you consciously look at it differently. So here she's consciously using a metaphor in order to access acceptance of that. And I'm not going to read this whole next quote, but basically this is Maggie's was saying how she no longer sees just the emotional high of a shopping experience. She could now see how the whole experience of it. So she's talking about I don't think about the buzz, the positive side. I'm thinking about the negatives. Things like, oh, I'm never going to wear it, or where am I going to put it? I've got too much. Do I want more polythene bags at home? So she's actually able to widen her perspective of the shopping trip to include the totality of it, not just focusing on that buzz and the high, which helps her to self-regulate, helps her to not actually go and shop. But it's quite interesting to think about how does this different understanding that they're able to have, how does it actually occur, and how is it achieved? And there's two different psychological mechanisms that seem to be going on with this. So the first one, Fran says, all my heightened awareness that's made me more aware of how I look, and I haven't got to a stage where I can accept and just be how I am. I keep trying and thinking, well, this is how I am now. I'm not going to suddenly lose a stone by tomorrow. I do sort of talk to myself about it, but not very successfully. Now, the point of this quote is I try to talk to myself. So what they're doing is they're using, we all have self-talk. It's going on all the time within us, but it's whether that self-talk is positive or negative. And a lot of it before, when she said, I'm very hard on myself, was all negative self-talk. Now she's actually using self-talk proactively in order to help her to accept, and this is how this reappraisal process happens. The other thing that happened was this idea of labeling. So Fran says that's one of the useful things, I think, as she said, label your thoughts. So if I find myself getting swept along, I try and step back and then, oh, that was a planning thought. I do a lot of planning thoughts, or that was an anxious thought. So she's actually just labelled what her thought was. And that the knock-on of that, she says, Well, before, I wouldn't even think about it. I'd be so swept along with it, I wouldn't know. I'd get caught up. And I think it makes me stop and see a bit. I don't know, so that you can't build on all the thoughts, because if you have one thought, if you label it, it's almost contained, isn't it? Whereas if you don't label it, you get that thought and another one and so on. Whereas if you think, well, okay, I've acknowledged that thought and I've labelled it, it's there and it's contained. So basically this spiral of these negative thoughts, which ultimately would drive them to want to go shopping, they'd use the labelling in order to contain it, acknowledge it, and then it's not sort of escalated into something unmanageable. So just to summarise where we are, we've got this big theme of self-regulation, and we've looked at the three on the left, so I'm just going to go through the ones on the right, except we're running out of time. So the first thing, another sort of process within this, what happened when they learn mindfulness, this separation between them and their experience. It's not really me, it doesn't have to affect me. So this is June talking about some stress in her life and her ability to distance herself from it. And Fran also said, I could still think about things but step back a bit, so that she's got that distance, and that's called decentering, and it's having a less identified relationship with thoughts and feelings. So not seeing the feeling as being that is me having that feeling. It's having that separation, and mindfulness does that very effectively. But conversely, or seemingly conversely, Fran says it just felt calmer, the actual decision. This was regarding a work promotion. But maybe that's because I was clearer about where I am with myself. So you, on the one side, you've got them being less identified with their thoughts and feelings, and here Fran is saying, I'm clearer about who I am. So there's a greater sense of self, and Fran said similarly, which is basically a strengthened or reified sense of self, which I can. It's kind of two sides of the same thing, really. So there was also what happens when you have to sit with yourself during meditation for 45 minutes a day. What happens is that a lot of things come up, a lot of negative things can emerge, but you have to stay with them. And Fran says, the bits to begin with I found really hard were when the teacher asked us to focus on thoughts, and at that point I could feel myself coming out in a sweat, and I just wanted to get up and leave the room. I could feel myself fidgeting. I can't, when will this be over? I've got to get out. And I said to her, so what did you actually do? Did you stay in the room? And she said, I stayed. No, I stayed. I kept. I mean, she sort of said, well, you're free to go if you want to, but I didn't. So this is actually, it's called exposure. So, and exposure therapy is used quite effectively with anxiety type issues. If you're afraid of spiders, then you'll gradually expose yourself to spiders. And this is what she's doing. She's got this huge intolerance to her own thinking process and her own negative emotions. But the mindfulness actually helps her to practice exposure to it. And remember, June said about that skirt that she had this emotional attachment to. She said, I think to myself, if I wore it a few more times, then that memory would fade away. So here she's realising that this exposure process can also be related to her relationship with material things. And the outcome, they actually felt a huge amount better at the end of this whole process, and it was very evident in the way that they interacted with me in the interviews as well. So June said, I've noticed with this course I'm beginning to feel more like I did when I was 20. I never worried about the past, I never beat myself up, and you do feel that kind of childlike simplicity again. So you could see that she had major depression and anxiety issues, and yet here she was after just 2 months of practicing this, that she actually could let a lot of the stuff go. And again, I won't focus too long on the graphs, but the solid black line again is this group of people. This is depression on the left, so you can see a massive drop in depression. And that's actually on that scale is from them being so-called severely depressed, and it takes them back all the way down to being minimally depressed. That's how the scale defines it. And there was a slight relapse. They went back up to being mildly depressed, but nevertheless a huge amount lower than where they'd started. And this is anxiety. So again, you can see a huge drop in anxiety, and then it stabilized 3 months later. So the final bit is basically to talk about the self-regulation of behaviour. We've talked about self-regulation of thoughts and feelings, but compulsive buying is a behaviour, and so I'm going to just talk a little bit about the self-regulation of behaviour. And what Nicole said is, I don't feel as much on autopilot, I feel more aware. So she's not anymore going into this automatically going shopping. Ethan said, so there's still a want to spend, but less, oh, I like that, I'll buy that. Because like I can get the pleasure from, oh, I like that, without having to do the till bit. So you can see that he can get the pleasure, but he doesn't actually have to spend the money. Again, it wasn't quite that straightforward. June put herself on a budget that she stuck to really well. But then she said when it came to buying that cream, her thing was face creams and cosmetics. I was sort of on a high thinking, oh well, I'm managing my debt and I'm controlling everything, so it won't matter if I buy that. So you can see it's not quite as straightforward. You know, she had been a shopping addict for probably 40 years. You're not going to just get rid of it straight away. And there was all this time, this negotiation going on with themselves. And Maggie describes, I've been very aware that I finished work, and for quite a few weeks I've finished work and I've had this tremendous desire to go shopping. And I've actually thought to myself, why do I want to go shopping? And I've actually sort of processed it, and I thought I don't need anything. And I had to really fight myself to drive home, and I came home, and as soon as I'm home it's fine because I can find other things to do. So she described it as a Jekyll and Hyde moment of these two voices in her head, I want to go shopping, no, I should go home. But she actually was able to sort of just go through that and then take herself home. There's a lot in the addiction literature about relapse, because that's kind of the golden nugget, if you like. If you can solve that, then you're going to get a long way in treating addiction. So I'm just going to mention briefly, June had what she classed as a major relapse. Her very elderly and difficult father came to stay, and she found it very, very stressful. And so here she says, when he left, I was so relieved. I thought, I need to do something for myself. And so I went to the beauty salon and had a body wrap and a facial. That was expensive, but I mean, I suppose that was nice in that it was something for me. But then I started spending on some clothes. I can only call it a spending spree. I mean, I must have spent £200-300. So she had classed it as a relapse, but through the mindfulness, actually, what she started to realise that lapse and relapse are not the same thing. And this could be classed as a lapse, but it doesn't have to lead to relapse. Because what she went on to describe, when her father had been with her, I just gave up on the meditation. I felt awful. I just didn't have time. I was so tired when I got to bed at night. I just gave it up. And that's why, you know, I had no resources when they'd gone to start being realistic and be mindful, which is why I went off the track. So there was this process of realization of not having any resources, which obviously mindfulness had become a resource. And she said, so anyway, when I'd taken them, brought these things back, so all those clothes she bought, she actually took back. I thought, you know, I've got to get back on this program. And in the last week, I started again on the program. I started doing the body scan like we started off before. And since I started back on the body scan, I know I'm much more positive again. It's amazing how that works, because you have to concentrate not to give in to all these wandering thoughts all the time, this constant bombardment. So you can see how the thought processes are fueling the shopping behaviour, but that the mindfulness practices help that to be stopped. So this study basically enabled me to show that although it was a small study and with limited people, it did help me to show that mindfulness has a lot of potential in terms of reducing this psychologically motivated buying, enabled to manage urges and cope with lapse and relapse, and basically it was a lot to do with self-regulation. But what I'm quite interested in sharing with you just in the last minute or so is is really how does this actually impact on sustainability and on consumption more broadly. So I'm just going to spend a moment on that. So particularly thinking about mindfulness and its potential relationship to sustainability. The first thing I want to just pose a question about self-focused awareness. Mindfulness is all about self-focused awareness, but what's quite interesting to think about, does it lead to self-knowledge and self-wisdom, or does it lead to selfishness and self-absorption and self-centeredness, which could be a natural outcome if you think you're focusing entirely on yourself? But it does actually seem that it leads to self-awareness in terms of self-wisdom and self-knowledge rather than selfishness. And I'm just going to briefly bring a quote up from my second study, which the second study I did before this one was I interviewed a group of people who had no particular psychological difficulties other than general stress, and I interviewed them at the end of a mindfulness course. And I'm just going to pull up one participant, because Steph said here, I think if I'm going to binge on chocolate, it should be ethical chocolate that I'm binging on. I think the desire to buy ethical products has been enhanced by doing the mindfulness course, because it all comes down to a realization I had quite near the end of the course, which is this kind of wanting to respect the world and the people in it is something I've had for ages, but it's very hard to have that sort of relationship with everything around me if I don't have the relationship with myself. And I go back to this whole having built up more of a relationship with myself thing, that I'm now finding it easier to open that up to the world around me and the people I'm interacting with. So if you like, this group of people, and Steph, they're not people who have this big psychological issues that they have to deal with, so they're probably more reflective of the general population. And you can see this, okay, self-focused awareness has actually led to this improved relationship with herself, which means that she's actually then able to open that up, which I think has quite interesting knock-on to if we're thinking about consumerism more broadly and sustainability. So the second thing I want to just touch on is acceptance, because what's quite a common misconception of mindfulness when we talk about acceptance is that everything should be accepted. And that's not quite how mindfulness sees it. Mindfulness will not encourage passive acceptance. It will encourage a discernment between what should be accepted and what should not be accepted. And you could see that in the compulsive buyers, because they were clearly not accepting of themselves as compulsive buyers. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been motivated to do the whole course and want to change. But yes, at the same time, there had to be a level of acceptance of this is who I am and this is what I've got to work with. So I think it's important to realise that mindfulness does not encourage passive acceptance, and that it's about actually encouraging that things should be challenged, and that it's about a discernment between what should be challenged and what should not be challenged. The third thing is this idea of breaking cycles. So I said quite early on, these vicious cycles that have been established, and mindfulness seems to be quite effective at actually stepping in and breaking these, which when you think about, if you like, our societal cycles of consumption, we need to do something that's going to break those, and I think there's something in there. I don't have all the answers, because these are maybe as much questions as outcomes, that maybe mindfulness has a role to play there.
Sorry, Alison, would that apply to the general public as well, or was that just for mindfulness?
Well, it came out of the work with the compulsive buyers, but I would say that we'd be naive to think that we don't all have cycles, these cycles within us, and they maybe aren't at the level where they're destroying our lives, but we all have to change our habits. Everyone's going to have to change habits if we're going to move society to being sustainable. So I would say it applies to everyone. And then finally, just to touch back onto my two main themes of consumerism and mindfulness, there's lots I could say about this. But basically, if I just talk about consumerism for a moment, one of the things that I haven't talked about is values. And what seemed to happen when I quoted Steph just now is that for somebody who already has values that include sustainability and care and concern for others more broadly. Mindfulness seems to enhance those values, and Schwartz would put those into the sort of benevolence and universalism type categories. It's quite interesting to consider what would happen if someone who didn't already have those values were to learn mindfulness, and what could happen there. So I think there's an open question around the relationship between mindfulness and values, and those values, how that impacts into consumption behaviour. And finally, on mindfulness itself, again, there's lots I could say. I would like mindfulness definitions to include acceptance as a more prominent word and idea. But I also think it's worth thinking about mindfulness in terms of where it's come from. It's come from Buddhism, and it's been extracted out of Buddhism to be a standalone secular practice, which has a lot of benefits to a lot of people. But I wonder whether mindfulness might have more potential if it was kept within a framework that included an ethical and moral foundation, because that's the one thing that has been left behind when it's been taken out of Buddhism. So there's lots of things still to kind of uncover in this area, but that's kind of where I've got to so far. And well timed, Tim. That's the end.
Thank you very much.
So,
Something very quick about Present Minds.
Present Minds is a company that I have just started. Basically, it's an umbrella under which I am exploring mindfulness in all sorts of different ways. Initially through teaching. I'm teaching at through the NHS. I've got a contract to teach with the NHS at the moment. I'm also starting private teaching and doing some consultancy work as and when it crops up. And it's kind of a throw this out and see where it's going to go, really.
Very good.
So if anyone has any questions, I'm sorry I spoke for slightly longer than I intended to.
We have a little bit.